Well, no, some stories are sad, but it happens. But, you know, we do have the strips here. Strips to remind people not to judge so harshly. Far beneath a beautiful country estate lies strange fate. For those unfortunate enough to have encountered a pair of mad, noble women. They had a secret, which would have run the blood code of those in the aristocratic circles they kept themselves in. The mad women had developed an unusual diet preference. Human toenails. Half-hearted soldier, drunken sailor, or sea wench, they were all preyed upon. The women went into the night to round up victims. They would wait outside tavern and dance hall for those inebriated enough not to put up a fight. A bag over the head and about 6 spins around was usually enough to knock even the stoutest person unconscious when they had been plied with enough drink. They would be locked into the chambers here on each side of us. Feet scrubbed, cleaned, and toenails carefully trimmed so as not to waste an ounce of the precious resource. I know what you're wondering. Why not just pull them out at the root? After all, it's a sensible thing to do. Well, the sisters weren't monsters, you see. They were just hungry, so very hungry. Each victim awakened, dumped on the outskirts of town, shoeless, sockless, pants rolled to the knee. But their feet were beautifully scrubbed, and their toenails perfectly trimmed. The sisters were caught when they mistook a pair of sleepy officers for inebriated, and then were overcome by them. Threatened with having their toenails pulled out at the root is the sensible thing to do. They confessed to the entire ruse. Afterward, they fell from grace and out of high society. They took on new identities, where they began working in a wash house, trimming the nails of those who came to bathe, thereby continuing to feed their insane and insatiable hunger. We know you may have worked up an appetite now here on our tour. That brings us to our very next display. Before you here is the long-necked crow. There is no need to fear the pulling of your organs through your flesh, however. This crow is a strict vegetarian, feasting on fruit and vegetables. This crow has wonderful breath. While not every long-necked crow has the ability to become invisible, this one does. While being carried on your shoulder, this crow may disappear at will. Have you run to your larder, only to discover it is missing the turnip water that you so crave? If so, an invisible long-necked crow could be to blame. This is also the grazing point on our tour. If you're in need of any type of refreshments, please step by the crow's larder, which may or may not currently be vegetarian.
Oh, thank you so much. So in the bowl, it's apples, right?
Today is apple day, you know, it varies day to day. You don't want to be here on bean day. That's a really terrible day. Well, after bean day is a terrible day.
Oh, I can imagine the smell just will knock you out over.
Oh yes, well, it's been known to chase sharks to the deepest ocean trench. It does help us get rid of our pests here, however. Existing in the push and pull of life is never easy, but we're fortunate if we get to choose which direction to move in. The elephants here were born connected at the trunk, found wandering alone on their desert home. They had been abandoned by their elephant family, but they were taken in by a nomadic group. It was determined not to separate them, lest one of them lose a most important appendage. They were eventually discovered and purchased by a traveling circus. Their most famous task was together drawing a large amount of water into their trunks and spraying it high above the audience. The constant confinement, coupled with the rote task of spraying the water night after night, drove them over the edge. On the night of their escape, they lifted the bucket of water, slammed it into the head of the ringmaster, crushing his skull, and with their combined trunks propelled his body higher into the tent than the high wire act. They made it out of the circus grounds and to the edge of the woods before they were set upon by the circus crew, who shot them dead as punishment. Their heads were preserved and have been exhibited with the casket and body of the former ringmaster in order to continue to tell their tale. Welcome to crack open the lid and take a look at the ringmaster
Why does the skull look so shiny?
Well, we did have a tour where someone decided that they needed to lick the skull. By licking the skull, I believe they have polished it quite a bit. Removed some of the dust. An unusual thing, but, you know, things happen. We don't have control over everything that happens at the museum.
Oh, yes. Definitely lose control
Uh,
in multiple areas of the museum.
No, this is not a tavern filled with delicious libations. In fact, if you had been here 50 years ago, you'd be dead. It wasn't unusual a long time ago to place additives into your spirits to give them an interesting afternote, be it bitter, sweet, or bittersweet. It was a long, unusually crowded evening the night before, and would begin at a combination inn and tavern. The tavern keep was too busy to go for the ingredient for a top note to add to the drink for next evening, and the tavern keep's sibling was sent instead to pick up the rare and delicious sweet ingredient Magistine. The herbologist, however, was also out, and in their stead their apprentice was working. The assistant herbologist mistook the requested Magistine for the more common pest remover Maggot Stem, nearly identical in both appearance and flavor. Coupled with that unfortunate similarity in name, the switch was made. The Maggot Stem was delivered to the tavern and used to give the tavern's libations their signature smooth sweetness. As is custom with a spirit house attached to overnight accommodations, the drink poured heavily and quickly. The hallucinations began an hour into the evening. The vomiting began shortly thereafter. Ingestion of maggot stem was said to produce hallucinations such as liquid running down the walls, inanimate objects breathing, skies filled with flying animals, and the mistaking of human form for animal. The chaos of the visions coupled with the vomiting began a putrid battle in the tavern, where all fought for their very lives. Many who made it outside were driven back in by the visions in the sky. Those victors who survived the vomitous battle were said to have lain unconscious on these very floorboards until their hearts slowed to death. In this case is a donated item. It is the short-necked vulture. Eating only meat, it is a counterpoint to the vegetarian long-necked crow from the grazing point on our tour. This vulture is said to pick human flesh, has a preference for blood, and is able to see in and is most active at night. Were this short-necked vulture to have been allowed to continue to breed, the offspring could have become a menace to human comfort, so it has been secured for all of our safety. I do still feed it late at night from our day's rattlesnake kill, and we each take turns allowing it to run its beak along our arms. It is in no way unhappy. In fact, it is now more serene, and the pecking of human flesh has been reduced to just a cursory first nip. If it continues this way, be careful not to fall into the pit. Below us here lies the coffin of the final husband of the widow of Shallow Creek. She was called a widow because she had buried 12 husbands. 11 were deceased. She begged for help from the townspeople and said she was being haunted by the vengeful ghost of her most recent husband. The widows of the town vowed to help her. They formed a group which would sit in the home of the widow while she tried to rest. It was a quick rotation. For you see, they all eventually stared straight again into the eyes of the man they used to know. Each night someone sat with her just before the skies began to lighten. There was a shuffling behind them. One after another, widows fled the still darkened, creaking home. Once that group was exhausted, the widows still pleaded for help. The young single men were sent next, as they were thought to be less prone to fright. Same story, however. They all ran for their lives after gazing into the eyes of the dead man. The oldest woman in town, thought far too frail. Ask, may I go next? She sat slumped forward, next to the warm fire in the chair, eyes closed, back to the room, when the ghost appeared. His long bony fingers reaching, clawing, slid up over the back of the chair and around the woman's frail, thin neck. From outside the home, a blood-curdling scream that chased wolves back to their dens was cut short. The townspeople worried for the frail lady, but humoring her, had kept their ears open for her call. A number of them reached the steps of the cabin at the same time and clambered to the front door, flinging it open. Standing tall over 2 bodies was the frail old woman. What no one realized is that the oldest woman in town was also the wisest. Unable to sleep well in the cold night due to her old bones, she slept during the warm daylight hours. Every night she watched the dead husband of the widow of Shallow Creek creep into house after house in town. But you see, as people went to sit with the terrified widow, her very much alive husband was looting the houses of those who came to help her. He would arrive later to show what he had stolen to his wife and scare them back to their homes. The oldest woman, however, went prepared, rolling pin in sleeve, to expose the ruse of the widow of Shallow Creek.
That one's always my favorite. You're always wondering about the first husband or the last husband, whatever happened to him.
Oh, yes. Well, you see, he wasn't dead after all. Very much alive husband. Don't panic!
I'm not panicking. Oh, yes, I'm panicking now.
I think it works best if you scream, "Don't panic!" It really helps people to settle and not feel like they need to panic anymore. Anyhow, don't panic. Don't panic. Hanging before you is only a representation of snake's belly plant. It is named snake's belly for its appearance and for the lethal toxic pollen it emits when it is in a blooming phase. The belly portion seen here, growing concealed in the ivy, grows like a lichen, and it blends in very well with its surroundings, as you can tell. The plant grows new roots at each cycle, and when the portion reaches maturity, it opens like a husk down the center and reveals a series of petals, which unfurl with pollen-emitting anthers at the end. Inhabiting only a few islands, the pollen, if inhaled, will cause an immediate headache, followed by confusion. It is said the confusion stage is followed by an internal heat and a thirst that, coupled with the confusion, often leads those exposed to dive into the nearest body of water, swimming down, 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 and staying underwater until they drown themselves.